Ascension Day is a day about absence. It's the day, after all, when we are remembering the disciples saying goodbye, when we're picturing Jesus leaving this place for somewhere else. It's a day when we are thinking about that bittersweet story that we heard read this morning. And so it's also a day that might call to mind absences in our own lives. I remember pulling out of the driveway at my grandparents' house after summer visits when I was a kid. We only made the trip once a year, and I can remember backing down that driveway and waving out the hot car window and watching the house get smaller as we drove away and thinking about the fact that even if I could talk to them again in the next year, it would still be a long time before I saw them again. Maybe Jesus' ascension is a little bit like that, or like sending a kid off to college, floating off toward a distant dorm room, or like blessing a member of our congregation who's returning back to a far-off home country after being a part of us for years. It's a story of absence. You can't get away from that, I think. Just look at the way the Ascension is usually portrayed in artwork. The image that's on the front of your bulletins is pretty typical. Jesus taking off into the heavens, with the disciples sort of craning their necks up as his feet disappear into a cloud. On the one hand, these pictures are a little bit funny, I think. I mean, the angels in the story from Acts are pretty clear that the disciples are not supposed to spend their time looking up into the heavens, watching for Jesus. So why do the artists always depict them that way, doing the exact thing that they are reprimanded for? Why not show them sort of patting each other on the back and getting to the work of being the church, which seems to be more what the book has in mind? Maybe the artists are showing us exactly what we are not supposed to do. On the other hand, maybe the artists are just catching something of the poignancy of the scene. Because these are human beings, after all, and Jesus really is leaving his friends behind. He's done being the guy with the scruffy hands and the kind smile who tells them which village they are supposed to visit next and passes them the salt at the table and makes them fish on the beach. He is headed for somewhere else. Our reading from the letter to the Ephesians that we heard this morning would agree with that idea. According to this letter, Jesus has gone a pretty long way from being that flesh and blood teacher and companion that he was. Jesus is now in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. That sounds a lot farther than going off to university on a plane. It sounds like Jesus has actually jetted off to unreachable heights that could hardly be farther from the Mount of Olives or from any other plot of ground, for that matter. And maybe nowhere sounds farther than that familiar phrase that's there in the reading that seems to sort of sum things up. Jesus has been seated at the right hand of God. We say that phrase every week in the Apostles' Creed, of course. If you come to worship regularly, the words just sort of roll off your tongue after a while. Where is Jesus? At the right hand of God, of course. Duh. But what do we mean by that? What is it that we confess about Jesus every week when we say those words? Are we talking about a literal place and a literal hand and a literal seat nearby for Jesus? Or are we talking about something else? I love what Martin Luther said about this question. It figured prominently into debates in Luther's time about whether Jesus could be present in the sacraments in worship or not. Some theologians and leaders at the time said that Jesus could not possibly be present in the bread and wine of communion because, of course, he was at God's right hand. He's not here, they said, he's up there. And Luther saw things differently. The right hand of God, he said, is a way of describing the almighty power of God, which at one and the same time can be nowhere and yet must be everywhere. He goes on to say that the power of God is present in the tiniest tree leaf, in the hairs on your arm, in a single kernel or seed. And at the same time, it's so vast and incomprehensible that neither this world nor even 1,000 worlds could hope to contain it. So when we talk about Jesus being at the right hand of God, Luther says, we are not talking about some dusty throne. We're not even talking about a single place. We're talking about Jesus being present wherever the power of God is present. In the raindrop that slides down the window, and in the far reaches of space, in the single human life next to you this morning, and in the billions of other lives making their way through the world. So when we talk about Jesus' ascension, we are not really talking so much about Jesus going up like a hot air balloon. We are talking about him being taken fully into the life of God. And when you think about it that way, Ascension Day is not only about Jesus' absence, it's also very much about his presence. Yes, he's absent in one way, but we confess that in another way, he is very much present. This confession is right at the core of that reading we heard from the letter to the Ephesians. I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation as you come to know him. It's easy to miss in the middle of all this language about how high up Jesus is, how far beyond all power and dominion and even beyond time. But at the center of this reading, which is really a prayer, is this conviction that Jesus can be known. Not only that we can know about Jesus, but that we can know him. Think for a moment about what an amazing assertion this is. I mean, when someone whom you don't know personally dies, we can try to learn about that person. The theologian James Cone died last month, and I can read his books, and I can talk to other people who admire and are challenged by his thinking and his work. I can even learn some of the details of his biography. And if I do all that, maybe I can say that I know something about him. But I could never say that I know him. And yet that's exactly what the letter says when it comes to Jesus. Jesus is not only a first century carpenter who taught and preached and challenged those in authority and died an untimely death. If that's all he was, then the best we could do would be to learn about him. But because he is at the right hand of God, we can know him. It's easy to forget that sometimes, isn't it? With all the words that come along with Christian faith and Christian worship, the readings, the songs, the prayers, the books of theology, the creeds, it can seem like the point to all of it is learning about Jesus. Next Sunday, we are confirming 3 of our young people from the congregation. They have completed 2 years of instruction, 2 years of learning about the Bible and some core Christian beliefs. Together, we have pored over the Apostles' Creed and the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer. We've talked about what Christian freedom means and what grace means and how we might understand our vocation as people of faith. All of it's important. All of it's worth studying. And I hope the students have learned a lot about Jesus. But all that learning is meant to point us toward the real substance of faith, which is knowing Jesus himself. If you ask me, that is what we are trying to be about here in worship. We have a few ordinary things: a little water, a book, a simple meal, and a room full of ordinary people. And our job is to trust that in these things and in these people, we can come to know Jesus. We can know him in water that names us beloved. We can know him in words that surprise us with their challenge and their joy. We can know him in a meal where there is room for everyone at the table and there is always enough to go around. We can know him in a community like this one, full of people who are hopeful and beautiful and a little battered by life sometimes. No, I'm not saying Jesus is trapped here. He isn't confined to the words of the Bible or to the elements on the table this morning. He isn't limited to the four walls that are around us. He's at the right hand of God, which can be everywhere and nowhere all at once. But he's promised to meet us here, in the church, which is his body. And we trust that promise, and we lean into it, so that knowing Jesus' presence here, we can be open and ready when we meet that presence everywhere. The angels told the disciples to quit staring into the clouds if they were looking for Jesus. And maybe this is something of what they were getting at. If Jesus is now the one who fills all in all, then you don't need to look farther than this world, than even this present moment, because in this moment, we can know Jesus, the ascended one, the one who is far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. There's no need to look up. Just look around. Amen.